radio personality and noted author, native of Chicago's Old Town neighborhood. Kogan was the son of a longtime newspaperman, Herman Kogan, and a longtime Chicago literary and journalism fixture, Mary Lou Kavanaugh Kogan. That's me, ladies and gentlemen. Jerry, why don't you tell them? Gerald Nicosia is one of my favorite writers. He's a poet. He's a nonfiction writer. He is a talented man who is, for me, the great chronicler of the Beat generation and all the amazing characters of that generation. He's also astonishingly prolific. In the space of 1 year, which was the only two highlights of my 2020, I gave Jerry about 2 of his books. We're going to try to cover a lot of territory in about 40 minutes. I'm going to have Mr. Nicosia read some of his poems. First, I want to go back, for two guys, when we were young men, you growing up in Lyons and me growing up in Old Town, I don't think under the most strange drug or strange imaginative leap we ever could have imagined that you and I would be doing this, what we're doing now, which is kind of a virtual book event. Me in Chicago, you in San Francisco. We are on the cutting edge of technology, but take me back to the young Gerald Nicosia in Lyons, because the more I think about it, Jerry, and the more I get to know you, the way in which you grew up with Czechoslovakian grandparents and Sicilian grandparents, and in that marvelous working class and very much mobbed up suburb of Lyons, that's what formed you, isn't it? And the values of not of the various clubs that lined Ogden Avenue, but the values of your grandparents and your parents. Your latest book, Beat Scrapbook, is dedicated to your grandparents and your parents. How did you form? You're a Midwestern guy, and as much time as you may have spent elsewhere, that's the heart and soul of who you are, isn't it?
Absolutely, yeah. Well, I grew up working class. My dad was a mailman.
Yeah.
All of you listening, you're going to have to bear with me. I am getting a little feedback, so if I act a little weird, it's because I'm hearing everything I say twice. But I'm going to go ahead and
go.
Anyway, I grew up working class. My dad was a mailman. My mom was a part-time secretary. My uncle had an auto repair garage on Ogden Avenue. I think when I talk, I'm going to take this out and then I'll put this back in when you talk.
Sure.
I can't do it well. Otherwise, I'm hearing everything I say twice. Anyway, my uncle had an auto repair garage on Ogden Avenue, Freemer's garage. We were working class Midwestern people, solid values. I think I told you when we did a radio show that I grew up believing that words meant something, that what you said meant something. You didn't goof around. You kept your word. You stayed true to your words.
How big?
This is all
okay. No, this is
anyway. I grew up believing that you kept your word. You meant what you said. You were loyal to your friends. You stayed true to what you believed in. And I got a great education out there. I mean, I have to say, I went to Morton West High School, and there were just absolutely great teachers out there. And after my sophomore year, people said, this kid is good at English. They funneled me into an honors juniors class, and it was taught by a guy named Mr. Baistu. And the only thing we did our whole junior year was supposedly American literature year, was just to read the great books. No more grammar, no more anything.
Yeah.
We read Thoreau, and we read Emerson, and we read Walt Whitman and Emily Dickinson. Just the whole year was reading Melville, Moby Dick. And that really, it was in Thoreau, which was tremendously impacted on me, war and civil disobedience. And of course, that's where the whole political thing came in, and conscience and trying to make America a better America. So that whole dimension entered into me, along with the fine art, along with the beauty of Whitman and Dickinson. I got a lot of, from Thoreau, I got the sense that writing could affect the whole quality of your community and who you were and who the country was. And I wanted to be part of that. I wanted to write, the things that I saw and witnessed, and I also wanted to be part of that, trying to make America, a better country again, truer to its own values, which Thoreau was doing it in Walden.
Let me ask you even when you're
people that worked hard all their lives and took care of their neighbors and took care of their friends and took care of their family. I mean, that was who I am.
When you, if you did, tell your parents and grandparents that you aspired to be a writer, at that time, that coming from especially working class parents, it doesn't seem like a viable career path. Were they, you know what I mean? I mean, it's like, no, you'll take over the garage, you'll do this, you'll do this. How are you going to make any money as a writer? How did you deal with that? I mean, you obviously love your parents, they obviously love you. When you made a decision to follow the precarious, financially precarious road to being an author, how did they react? Supportive?
Well, I was very lucky in that both my mother and my father, my father less so. I'll say my mother first. My mother had written a social column for the Brookfield newspaper back in the 1920s.
Really? Oh, that's great. That's great. I didn't know that.
So my mother, in fact, my mother had aspired to be a writer. She wrote a novel. She couldn't go to college because during the Depression, her family lost everything. The banks closed,
Sure.
lost all their money. They lost their house. She had to go to work at 16 to support the family.
Wow.
But she had written a novel and couldn't get it published. But she always wanted to be a writer. Not going to college, she never was able to go back to that. But she, she really believed and wanted me to be a writer, which she knew that I would. My father loved. He grew up on the streets of Chicago, West Side, Little Italy, Hell's Baker, it was called, Halstead and Taylor. His father was killed in a shot to death in a tavern when my dad was 5 years old, and so my dad had shoe shining when he was 5 years old to help support his mother. His mother was taken care of by Hull House there, as you know.
Sure, Jane Addams Hull House. Sure.
And there were three other kids, four kids altogether. But he ended up, I think, dropping out of school completely when he was 12. But he loved to read. He read all of Jack London by the time he was 17 or 18. And of course, in those days, they had something called the Police Gazette, and full of poetry, street poetry.
Sure.
Barroom floor kind of thing. He memorized all those poems. He had hundreds of poems that he memorized in his head, but he used to recite to me when I was a kid. So he loved poetry, and he would read to me from Jack London. He read to me from the Iron Heel when I was 10 years old, and told me about class warfare. And again, that reinforced this whole social, political side of myself.
Well, it gave you what I think, and I didn't know any of this. That gave you an astonishing foundation, I think, for the life that you have chosen to lead. I had no idea about your mom being a novelist or your dad being a kind of visionary, seems like kind of a socialist, but a visionary socialist.
Socialist, yes.
Yeah, no kidding. So after Maine East, you then decided to go to college here too. You decided to stay here, right?
Well, yeah, I went to Circle. I was really poor. I went to Circle campus. The tuition in those days was like $30 a quarter. I mean,
yeah, I know.
My daughter went to American University in Washington, D.C., and the tuition was $55,000 a year, but I was paying $30 a quarter. And of course, commuting, because Circle campus was they had no dormitories in those days. So I just commuted to Ryan, drove in every day, drove back home again. But I should say, one thing I wanted to say was that my dad, having grown up on the streets and worked in many different jobs during the Depression, ended up as a mailman where he said the great thing about being a mailman, they can't fire you. You don't lose your job, because during the Depression, people were losing their jobs every 6 months. But he was more practical, and he kept telling me, you've got to have something to earn a living with. I mean,
sure.
So it's one of the reasons I got a teaching degree, actually, but I didn't know that when I got out of college in 1971, with the height of the Vietnam War, all these people, especially guys had gone into teaching, there were no teaching jobs available in 1971.
Exactly.
Teaching for a long time.
When did you, Gerald Nicosia, when did you really start to write seriously? Not for school, but even for yourself. When did you aspire to be a published author, and how did that start? What was the spark for that?
Well, I had been writing poetry since I was 8 years old. I mean, I remember when I met Gregory Corso, and I used to hang out with Gregory Corso. He asked me, he said, "When did you start writing?" I said, 8 years old. He said, "I did too." So we had that in common. We both started writing poetry at 8 years old. But I said, I was always writing. By the time I was 16, I was writing little novels and stuff. I always loved to write. And when I went to college, I was getting a teaching degree because, again, my dad said, you got to do something practical.
Have a job, yeah.
But I was writing all the time when I was in college. And when I got out of college, there were no teaching jobs, and I went back to get my graduate, and then the draft was expiring, so I was able to not worry about that. For a while, I was worried about the draft, and when I got out, the draft had expired in '71 briefly, and I was no longer vulnerable for that year. And I went back to graduate school, got my MA in '73, and again, there were no teaching jobs, so I went into substitute teaching and freelance writing, book reviews, and any little things that I could get published. And then I met a guy in Chicago named Carl Mackey, whose father had a lot of money. His father was one of the kingpins of the British Candy Company. And he said, "I'm starting a magazine called X. We're going to have radical content, tons of money." The money was all from his father, of course. He said, "What would you like to do?" I said, "I'd like to write a biography of Jack Kerouac," because I had discovered him when I was in graduate school, but nobody was teaching him. Then I just discovered it on my own.
Right.
He said, "Yeah, go ahead. I'll serialize your biography in my magazine." Well, he gave me, my $150 for the first bus ticket to New York, but I got in on the tail end of this. He'd been spending his father's money for 3 or 4 years, and his father finally pulled the plug. And so when I got to New York, he had to call me up and say, "Sorry, my dad just cut off the money." And I'd started. I said, at that point, I'm not going to quit. I'm just going to keep going if I have to sleep on people's floors. Or once I started interviewing people, it was so exciting meeting people that knew Kerouac that I decided I was going to keep going, even though the money was gone.
Well, for that book, which is titled, and you should buy it, you can buy Jerry's current book by clicking on this little thing down here, Beat Scrapbook. But Memory Babe, which was published in 1983, you interviewed for that book. I had forgotten that's the seed of that. This guy who said, "Go to New York, here's $150. You interviewed 300 people, most of whom had known Kerouac. And that book, when it was published it got not only wonderful reviews, it got terrific reviews from people who knew Kerouac, who was not the world's easiest guy to be friends with. I mean, he was a difficult guy, especially in his later years. But I just want to read this. Allen Ginsberg, who I think in many ways, as you know, was in love with Kerouac, don't you think? Allen Ginsberg called Memory Babe, published in 1983 by Grove Press, a monument of Kerouac. Smells and tastes like Kerouac, has a powerful impact, and a mountain of life detail I'd forgotten. Great book. You must be, in so many ways, that's, almost 40 years ago, you must still be so proud of that book. I have ever called it in print and in public, the definitive Kerouac book.
Well, unfortunately, it's been out of print for 20 years, and a lot of that, which we've talked about on the radio show, was my supporting Jack Kerouac in her attempt to try to get the estate back, which was from her with a forged will, and she died of kidney failure, and the case finally went to trial 15 years later, and the nephew won the case, but by then the statute of limitations had kicked in, and it was proven that there was a forgery, and the whole Kerouac estate was stolen by the Samples family, but they didn't have to give it back because of the statute of limitations. And so they've used a lot of that power to keep Memory Babe out of print. But in the meantime, I've done a lot of other books on the beat, and I've also done a major revision and updating of Memory Babe, which hopefully is going to be published next year by a person in New York, Hill. So, for me, and I'm hoping that it's going to come out next year in revised version.
As well, it should be. Would you, Jerry, in that book, I mean, Kerouac, the legacy of Kerouac is, you would no doubt say, is a complicated one, don't you think?
His legacy?
Yeah.
Well, yeah, I mean, there's a tremendous legacy, a good legacy, in that he freed up so many people, I think, to find themselves, to seek their own form of life. I mean, as Kerouac's biographer, I would run into, and I still run into people that tell me, Kerouac changed my life. I got out of my small town. I quit my job. I went on the road. I found a new life. I found a new woman. So open people up to being something other than, just like I grew up in Lyons, where, Uncle was telling, because, we never got into it, but beside my mother and father, everybody else in the family was saying, you're never going to make it as a writer. Don't even think.
Of course. Get a job. Get a real job. Yeah.
He was really upset with me, my Uncle George. What do you think you're doing? You're throwing your life away being a writer. Why don't you come and work in my auto garage? So I didn't get any support from the rest of the family. I grew up with all of that society pressure too, and I remember, I was very anti-war, especially after I read Thoreau. I felt I could follow my conscience. Sure. I had a right to follow my conscience. And then, I was a Catholic. I went to the Catholic Church, St. Barbara's in Brookfield, and there's the priest saying, it's your duty to go to Vietnam and fight those communists. And I'm like, wait a minute, the priests are telling me to fight. I went out and bought my own Bible, which as a Catholic you weren't supposed to do, as you might remember. I don't know if you were raised Catholic, but they told you, don't read the Bible. It's too subversive. The priest said, just listen to us, we'll interpret it for you. I went out and I bought my own Bible. And I said, wait a minute, it says forgive your enemies. It says love your enemies. It doesn't say, kill your enemies.
Well,
so
all I know about the Bible is
pressure to be, a certain
the Bible does say,
Thoreau, but also Kerouac had that influence of telling me, no, you can be something different. You can follow your dream. You can follow your conscience. Thoreau said, follow your own bent, your own genius as far as it leads you. So, Kerouac did that for so many people. But, it's a mixed legacy, as you say, because the Beats were also associated with alcohol and drugs, sexual freedom, which sometimes became sexual excess. You can throw away the bad things in society, but when you throw away everything in society, it causes problems. And of course, there were a lot of casualties among the Beats. People ended up in jail. Herbert Huncke and Ray Bremser, people had spent, even Corso spent 3 years in jail. People had died early, drug overdoses, and so on. It's a mixed legacy. Yes, it's definitely a mixed legacy.
Well, let's talk for a second then. I think this leads in perfectly to Jerry's recent books. Kerouac, The Last Quarter Century, is what I called in print in the Tribune, a searing, passionate, and detailed indictment of, quote, how Kerouac's legacy has been travestied and sullied by some very bad people. First, Jerry, how was it sullied? And then who are these bad people? Because I found this book, Kerouac, The Last Quarter Century, to just be so sad what these people have done to one of my favorite writers and one of the most influential writers I've ever known. Who were these people? And then get into how they have sullied that legacy.
Well, it's still a sad story, Rick, because, Jan Kerouac, his daughter, died in 1996 of kidney failure. But
your friend of yours,
there's another grandchild who was robbed. Jack Kerouac had a sister who also died young, and she had one son named Paul Blake Jr. He died 2 years ago, but his family is very, very poor. He had a child, and the child had several kids. His son Paul Blake III is now like 43 years old. He had a heart attack recently, partly from the stress. They live in a trailer in Arizona. They're dirt poor, and these are the closest blood relatives of Jack Kerouac. Jan was washing dishes and working in corn canneries much of her life, and it was all because they didn't know why it was. And of course, much later, people were able to find the will. It was not Kerouac's will. Kerouac had died of alcoholism in 1959. He left everything to his mother, who was paralyzed in bed with a stroke. But the family that he married a woman to take care of his mother, not a good reason to get married. Stella Samples was his older sister of a boyhood friend. He couldn't find anybody to take care of his mother. Kerouac was totally almost dominated. We can say more than just loved. He loved his mother, but it was more than that. It was almost an unhealthy. By his mother. And his mother said, I'm not going into a nursing home. Somebody's got to take care of me here in the house. And he couldn't find anybody. So he finally married the older sister of a boyhood friend, Stella Samples, to take care of his mother. Bad reason, bad marriage. He was trying to divorce her 3 years later. He died before he could divorce her, so they were still married. But what happened was his mother, the old woman, was in the bed, paralyzed, wasn't going anywhere. She lived 4 more years, and when she died, the Samples family wrote their own.
They said, here's a will.
And so that completely cut out Jan Kerouac and the other grandchild, this old woman, Gabrielle Kerouac. Kerouac's mother had two grandchildren, Jan Kerouac and Paul Blake Jr. Both of them got nothing, and both of them had really hard lives. And the Blake family in Arizona, Paul, the nephew, died 2 years ago, but the family is still living in poverty with health problems. It's a very sad legacy, and the family that has, inherited everything. Stella died in 1990. She left everything to her 8 or 9 brothers and sisters. John Sampas, who was her brother who died a couple of years ago, has left it now to his nephew, and they're monetizing it completely. I mean, they recently auctioned off Kerouac's underwear. Can you believe that? This was only a year. No,
I can't. Well, these people,
Kerouac's shorts were selling for $1,000 on the internet. His undershorts. And now recently they created something called the Kerouac Society. You have to pay dues to join it, and the privilege that you get by being a member of the Kerouac Society is you can buy all this special merchandise: Kerouac notebooks, Kerouac pens, Kerouac cups.
Regulators.
You can look it up on the internet, the Kerouac Society. If you want to pay the dues, you can buy all this merchandise.
Well, they've been very, very shrewd about it in that, I'll see a kid every month or so with a Kerouac t-shirt on.
Yeah.
Probably never read On the Road, but they've marketed him as some kind of like the Elvis of the literary world. And it's disgusting to me.
Yeah, well, of course, and especially since Kerouac was the least mercenary author. I mean, for years his books he couldn't even sell them; they were too radical, too experimental. He took a vow of poverty, took a Buddhist vow of poverty. He said, "I'm going to keep writing these experimental books to speak the truth of God. I don't care if I never make $1." And for years he barely had any money at all.
Now, let me just ask you before we move on to your latest book, Beat Scrapbook, but you people must buy Kerouac, The Last Quarter Century, too. If you have any affection for Jack Kerouac, but also if you have any interest in how icons can be manipulated for monetary gain, it's a fascinating book on the legal level, on a journalistic level. And before we get on to Beat Scrapbook, talk about your relationship, so to speak, and I use this in quotes, Jerry, your relationship with the Sampas family. They must hate you.
Well, they do, and they've done everything they can to keep Memory Babe out of print and to keep me out of conferences, to keep me out of anthologies. And a lot of it is like a vendetta. It's like a revenge. Yeah, sure. I supported Jan Kerouac's lawsuit against them. I was one of the main people providing Jan with evidence and material to help her lawsuit. They know that. But they didn't like, even before Jan filed her lawsuit, they were mad that I revealed a lot of things about their family that they had kept hidden. For example, I was the first person to discover that Jack was divorcing Stella when he died. He was in the process of divorcing her. It had not gone through. But they had put out this fake story that Jack married her. She was, like his childhood sweetheart. They didn't put out anything about marrying her to take care of his mother. He married his childhood sweetheart, wonderful marriage. And of course, I revealed that he was seeing his lawyer every week when he died with he had a hemorrhage because of the liver.
Ooh, yeah.
Seeing his lawyer every week. Had he lived a little longer, the divorce would have gone through. I also revealed the fact that he wanted to get out of their family. He didn't like the control that their family was exerting on him. I revealed the fact that their family had let's say, I don't know if I can use the word mafia here, but it had underworld connections. Nicky's Bar in Lowell was a place where there was prostitution, bookie operations, nude dancing. Tony Sampas, who was Stella's brother, was one of the biggest bookies in Lowell. He's dead now. I guess we can say that. I wrote it in my book anyway.
Yeah. So
and also their father had committed murder. The Sampas father committed murder in a Greek dice game and was put in jail for 30 years. I revealed all of that in Memory Babe, which they had kept all of this hidden, So obviously they didn't like me even before Jan filed the lawsuit. I had revealed all of this.
Well, because you're the truth teller. And I think that is something that has marked all of your work. I mean, poets are in the business, I think, of telling the truth and telling the truth that some people may not even want to hear.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I can't try to remember that William Carlos Williams quote about poetry gives you the truth that people need to know that they die for not knowing. Oh, I've messed up the quote, but it was something like that. That William Carlos Williams said, the poems give you the truth that you need to know, and that men die every day for lack of that knowledge, you know. But yes, I do believe in the truth. And, you know, it caused conflicts even when I was writing Memory Babe, because I had problems with Allen Ginsberg, who, you know, obviously later gave me that great quote, but he wanted me to not put in anything about Kerouac's bisexuality. And when I was researching the book, I obviously discovered that there were dozens, maybe 100 men that Kerouac went to bed with. He was bisexual. He liked women very much, but he also went to bed with a lot of men. And I put that, Ginsberg got to read the manuscript before it went to the press. And Ginsberg, very angry at me, he said, you've got to take all that bisexuality out of the book. And I said, but Alan, it's true. He said, yes, but it will give the critics of Kerouac more ammunition against him. There was this New York critic, Norman Podhoretz, who hated Kerouac.
Oh, God, yeah, right.
For the degeneration of Western society. And Ginsberg said, you're going to give Norman Podhoretz even more ammunition against Kerouac if you leave this in your book about bisexuality. And I said, but Alan, my job as biographer is to tell the truth about Kerouac, white or black or gray, whatever it is, because I'm writing for the future generations. The future generations need to know everything about him to understand him and his work completely. So I had a big fight with Allen Ginsberg, and he was very unhappy, but I put the bisexuality into the book because I said, it's part of his life. It's got to be there. And that's always been my position. I've always fought for the truth, and I've paid a high price for it in some cases.
I'll bet. You've been ostracized by, you know, the Sampras family are the worst. They're the evil people in this whole Gerald Nicosia story for me, boy. So again, people, you should be buying, among Jerry's many books, Kerouac, The Last Quarter Century, to realize what has happened to this man's reputation. I remember there used to be a place in Chicago that was called Kerouac Jack's Restaurant and Lounge. It was on the north side. It had a jukebox, and I'm thinking, Kerouac, really, that book, and I know I'm talking to dozens of you people out there, On the Road was a seminal book for many of us of a specific age, that age being somewhere in late teens, early 20s, and I have the feeling it has been that way for all people, especially guys in their late teens and early 20s, and it's a masterful, seminal piece of American literature. This recent book, Jerry, your most recent book, Beat Scrapbook, and you know how charmed I was by this book, because in part, it's a poetry collection. But on another level, it is a very, very intense kind of memoir. Was that your intention?
Well, no, I mean, it didn't start out that way. These poems in Beat Scrapbook were written over a long period, many decades of time. And, you know, I mean, I've always been a poet. I told you I started writing poetry when I was 8 years old. But among the different things that I would write as poems, you know, I did become part of the Beat, post-Beat world, I call it, in San Francisco. Poets that followed, well, the Beats were still alive when I got to San Francisco in the mid-70s, 1970s, but of course they started dying off. But there was this whole generation of, and then following generations of younger poets who were following the Beats and inspired by them. I became part of that whole community, and close to many of those people, and close to many of the original Beats, as you know, by Beat.
Sure.
And when they started dying, it was like, well, they were friends who meant so much to me that I would. And oftentimes there would be memorials for people like Jack Micheline or Gregory Corso when they died. So I would write a poem and I would read a poem at a memorial. And it just, a lot of people, you know, more and more people died, and these poems started building up. But I also realized eventually that not only did I have probably enough poems for a book, but that the poems did sort of constitute a memoir of my life, because the people that you know that deeply influenced you, I mean, that is the history of your life, right? If you that gave you the way of looking at the world, the way of writing, the way of relating. So I realized that not only are these poems important for the fact that, you know, they're tributes to these different people, but they also mark different stages in my life, because these are the people that gave me parts of myself, gave me who I became.
Well, I think an interesting one, the book begins with a poem titled The Beat Father of Chicago Poetry. It is a person that Jerry and I both know, that my father knew very, very well, but who I think has sort of vanished from the
Yes.
of understanding and knowledge. I promised you people that I would have Jerry read some of his own poetry. This is the one I'd like you to start with, Jerry. Could you read that? And then afterward, talk a little more about the subject of that poem.
Okay, I'm going to read the poem to Paul Carroll, who was a professor at the
University of Chicago,
where I went to school, and who I became friends with. Later on, I went back to teach. In the mid-'80s, I came back from San Francisco for 3 years to teach at the University of Illinois Chicago Circle campus from '85 to '88. And so I was there as a student originally, and then there as a teacher. And over all those years, became friends with Paul. And of course, when I became a teacher there, I became even closer friends. And, you know, in those years, the mid-'80s, I would go out to lunch with Paul a lot, walk down to Greektown with him.
Yeah.
So he became a very close friend and mentor to me as well. And I'll read the poem, and then I would like to talk about him, because I think there was a conscious effort by a lot of people to push him aside. He did so much for Chicago. I mean, I know maybe I should read the poem first, but
yeah, okay.
Brought the beat writers to Chicago. He started Big Table magazine. He liberated the University of Chicago magazine and brought in writers that they were afraid to put in, like William Burroughs. He founded the Poetry Center in Chicago. He founded the writing program at the University of Illinois Chicago Circle campus. He was kind of I see him as one of the fathers of modern Chicago literary scene poetry.
No question.
And was pushed aside consciously by people that wanted his place, wanted his eminence. But let me read the poem, and we can talk more about him. I'm going to take the thing out of my ear so I don't get the rebound sound. And this poem, which opens the book, is called The Beat Father of Chicago Poetry. Paul Carroll was a drinker and a kind man. We split many a bottle of wine, and in my mind's eye, whenever I recall him, I see a half-empty bottle of Roditas on the table in front of us in a noisy, narrow, crowded restaurant in Chicago's Greektown. And Paul is smiling, always smiling, as he always pours the wine into my glass before his. There was nothing this man wanted more than the company of those who liked him and his poetry. And from that gentle need, he created a whole world of Chicago literature and a community of writers who learned to give more than they took. The Circle Campus Writing Program, the Poetry Center, Big Table Press. He spun out an array of beautiful clothes for every poet and writer in Chicago to wear. For all of us in this city had been naked or near naked since the city burned down, and we all grew up so hard, naked in the cold, that we didn't know how hard our life was till Paul Carroll brought us warm and beautiful clothes and rose-colored wine to drink. And the poets and writers of Chicago got so drunk on that wine, they forgot who had brought it to them. They forgot the beat father of Chicago poetry as they went on to their various successes. They forgot that he had written it all 1,000 times better before any of them had touched pen to paper. They did not honor him, and his last bottle of Roditas emptied, but he still kept smiling and walked away from the table to a land called North Carolina and wrote us all letters on ruled yellow legal paper to keep us strong in remembering all the great poets before and after him that his life stood as a permanent tribute to, and his death will transform into seeds of endless rebirth.
That is really a lovely poem, because I was younger, but my father was friends with Paul, and I knew Paul, and I read Paul, and that really, really is such a lovely homage to this guy, Jerry. Much credit to you. How easily, I have to ask you, because that poem just flows like this, how easily do poems come to you? I mean, how easily, and how much writing do you ever have to do? I'm not a poet, so I don't know.
Well, it's a good question, because I'm a prose writer and a poet, and prose is much more of a struggle, as you probably know. Prose is a struggle. You go back over it and you try to get in what you left out, and With me, poems come very quickly. At least the first draft.
Wow.
The first draft comes. I'll be thinking about it maybe for a few days, but when I sit down to write, it does flow through me very fast. But then I'll go over it, and I'll maybe sound means a lot to me. Rhythm means a lot to me in poems. And when I look at what I've written, I'll think, oh, wait a minute, that line, the rhythm isn't quite right there. It's stumbling a little. I want to get a better beat to it, And I'll change a word here or a word there. And then sometimes I will also think, well, wait a minute, this isn't quite saying exactly what I meant. I do need it. So I do a little revision. I will recast. Sometimes I'll recast one line 30 times because I can't quite get it to say what it says.
Right. That's fascinating.
The original draft comes very, very quickly. And then there's a little bit of tinkering afterward. And sometimes I've tinkered actually for years before I actually get a poem the way I really exactly want it to be.
What do you think? Again, let me ask you about it. This is a weird question. Broad, wide-ranging question. What do you think is the state of American poetry these days? I am at a loss to figure it out. I read a lot of poetry, and I am at a loss to figure out. Maybe there'll be an outpouring after this, excuse me, everybody, fucked up year that we've just had. An outpouring of interesting and moving poems. Can you, as one of America's leading poets, can you give me a sense of the state of poetry in 2020?
Well, it's very fragmented.
Yeah,
it's very fragmented. The Beats, I think, were the last great movement of poetry, where you had a whole movement of people. They wrote in different styles, Gregory Corso and Gary Snyder, Ferlinghetti, very different styles, but there was sort of a bedrock of core values that they believed in, speaking to the people, using language that ordinary people understood, writing about things that ordinary people cared about. There was a bedrock of what they were trying to do, but they were all craftsmen, and all of them spent a lot of time. Even Kerouac, find out later, did revision, although he didn't revise, but he did. They were craftsmen. What came after that, I think, was a lot of people. They saw that the Beats were confessional. They were autobiographical. They were telling the stories of their life, and a lot of people, or young people, thinking they're going to be poets, think, "Oh, this is easy. I can just tell the story of my life." But you end up getting a lot of bad poetry that way, because the Beats, as I say, they were careful craftsmen. They would actually leave things out. They would work on the rhythm and the sound of their poems. It's not just as simple as telling your whole autobiography. And so I think there was a lot of bad poetry in the 60s that came out as sort of imitation beat. It then got a reaction against that. You got a movement that I think really did a lot of damage to American poetry called the language poets. And they were sort of anti-beat. Anything the Beats were, the language poets said, we're not. You shouldn't even have the pronoun I in the poem. No I in your poem. The poem shouldn't be about anything. It should just be language, line, playing with language, so on. And you got all this sterile stuff. Yeah, a lot of fun words, sometimes even a little rhythm, but the poems don't say anything. They're not about anything. And people just got turned off very quickly, almost like they did with the academic poetry. The Beats were rebelling against. And so the language poets, and they're still out, but a lot of them are still working and functional. They took poetry into a whole different direction, which I don't think is a good direction. I still think that this writing from the heart, the confessional poetry, is the main vein, or where that's where I am anyway. But again, you have to do it. You have to have the sense for the rhythm of music and the poetry. I think the fact that I have read my poems aloud a lot has helped me to refine that sound and that rhythm. It's not just as simple as pouring out your whole life story, and it's also selection. A great poem. There's 2.5 pages. I mean, I could have put in 500 pages. I spent hours and hours with that man. But if I did that, it would be a book or a biography. If you're going to do it as a poem, you have to select the most.
That's right. You have to exactly, Jerry.
Well, I mean, there are some good poets working today. And a few of the great poets are still alive. Even Gary Snyder is at 90 is still writing. It's a fragmented scene. There's no core direction to it. So
I agree.
You kind of have to hunt and pick to find the really good poets.
Well, I want to hear another really good poem. I'm so taken with so many of the poems in BEAT Scrapbook, Jerry's latest book, that you can buy here for 10% off. I'm not sure how to click this. I go in a store and say, give me 10% off. Your poem about someone we both knew, Steve Goodman, who died very moving poem. I think the title is The Disappearing Non-Folk Singer Blues. Could I put the arm on you to read that?
Oh, I'd love to. Sure. Do you have the page handy, by the way?
I have no idea what page it's
Okay,
on. I'll keep rambling until you find it. It's just Steve was, and that's another thing. You think, Bob Dylan just sold his entire oeuvre to some university, maybe Stanford, for, I don't know, $600 million. And Bob Dylan's a poet.
Right.
Songwriters are poets. Steve Goodman was a poet. And it just, if you're a poet who gets your poems set to lyrics, then you can make a lot of money.
You've always done way better than poets as far as making money, but I've got it here and I'll read it for you.
Great. Thank you. Here, everybody.
I'm Italian. I got to have a sip of coffee.
Go ahead.
All right.
You can start thinking in about 5 minutes.
Disappearing folk singer, non-blues. Steve Goodman came to visit me today. He had the same goofy grin on his face that he wore all over Chicago at his concerts and getting high with his friends while dodging Chicago's feel-good police and telling, as they said, the worst jokes ever heard. I remember him fast-moving in the flesh in the lobby of the Evanston Holiday Inn, barely glimpsed his face as he hurried by, guitar case slung at his side, maybe a ghost already, as Kerouac would have said, on his way to the stars. What a blessed man, and how blessed I was by his visit today. He belted music at me, out of the blue, out of the thin air. He ran me over with the city of New Orleans. He told me everybody needs to live as long as they possibly can, because living on earth is the art of beating the disappearing railroad blues and beating any kind of disappearance whatsoever by finding your own immortality. You need to love life, he told me, because it's gone soon enough. He touched my shoulder. He touched me on the shoulder, and then he left. And by God, his visit was the realest thing in my day, and maybe the realest thing I'll ever know.
I love that poem.
Thank you.
It just goes to everything that Steve was. Do you now, and again, ladies and gentlemen, the name of that book is like, just go to Barbara's, go to one of the many Barbara's. Most of them are still open for many hours a day. Go to Barbara's bookstore and go in and buy a book by yourself. You may not get the 10% off, but it's worth it, every one of them. Jerry, what are you working on now?
Well, I'm working on a big biography of Ntozake Shange, the Black woman writer and poet who wrote for colored girls who've considered suicide and Rainbow is Enough, and many, many other books. Not anywhere is near well recognized or known. Nope. It should be not taught in a lot of even African American literature courses. To me, she was as creative with language as Kerouac was. She was an absolutely brilliant lyricist with language, but she had a lot of problems in her life, substance abuse problems. She ended up in mental institutions a couple of times. She got sidetracked. She kept writing till the very end of her life. She died about 2 years ago. But one of the problems was that she made all the breakthroughs. That the play, which was a play in poetry for colored girls who've considered suicide, really opened the door for writing honestly about Black women's lives. She talked about the fact that Black men don't often treat Black women very well, that Black women have a harder lot in some ways than Black men have. She had the courage to write that when a lot of the Black liberation writing in the 60s, which was what motivated Ntozake Shange, was Black male writing, was Leroy Jones and Ishmael Reed, and it was Black liberation, but it was all from the man's point of view. And she had the guts to say, well, hey, Black women have had it even rougher, and she got slammed for that. I mean, even a lot of the Black male writers put her down for that. Ishmael Reed put her down, and Leroy Jones, Amiri Baraka put her down for that. But then combining that with the later substance abuse and mental problems, she got sidelined. But she had opened the door, and she had used this language and written honestly. Then you had people coming along like Toni Morrison and Alice Walker, and many other Black writers following on her breakthroughs who became wildly famous, world famous, got the money, got all the attention, and people forgot, as they forgot about Kerouac for a while, they forgot about Ntozake Shange. When she died, she had very little money. Very little money. Her family was helping to support her in a nursing home. She had a lot of health problems. And I was a good friend of hers, and I had always promised her someday I'm going to write a book that will give you the credit that you deserve as the pioneer that you were, just as I gave Kerouac the credit that he was.
Do you find people eager to talk about her? I'm sure you do. Yes.
Well, I was lucky that she was still alive when I began working on the book, because a lot of Black people and Black writers have an understandable wariness about talking to white people.
Right, of course.
And I'm a white man writing about a Black woman. I mean, that's really jumping two gaps. I had her, we were really good friends, not romantic, but I was say I loved her, but I loved her as a friend. She loved me as a friend. And she would tell people, cooperate with Jerry, give them all the truth. And in fact, it became an issue because some people said, well, and especially her family, they said, we don't know if we want people knowing that you were in a mental institution, that you had drug problems. And Zaki, and I had a talk with Zaki at this time, and I said, Zaki, if I write your biography, I got to tell the whole.
You have to.
I got to tell the whole truth. I can't cover up part of it. And Zaki was with me 100%. She said, Jerry, I want you to tell everything about my life, not just the good parts or the joyful part. You tell them about what I had to go through, and including the mental institution. And so I had that permission from her. And so she would tell her friends, tell them the whole story. I'm not giving that permission. So I was lucky that I had that.
Wow. How long? That seems like a big project. Yes.
It's a big project, and part of the problem is that the publisher has not financed it to the tune that I needed. And I've had an issue with the publisher. Why haven't you delivered the book?
Yeah. Well, why haven't you paid me to do it? Yeah.
Interviews on tape. If you know anything about transcribing tapes, it's very, very expensive.
Yes.
I traveled many thousands of miles because when I knew Zaki originally in San Francisco, but she moved to New York in 2004 or something.
Wow.
After that, I had to keep traveling back and forth between San Francisco and New York, which is very expensive. Plus, trying to transcribe tapes. And I kept asking the publisher, I need more money, and they'd say, no, we're not giving. And of course, the state of publishing right now. I don't.
The state of publishing is horrifying and bad.
Bestsellers.
Well, this is one of the reasons why I'm so glad Barbara's bookstore is still in operation. I mean, they're fighting the good fight to be an independent bookstore chain, actually, in this weird time. Jerry, I cannot tell you, we've hit 50 minutes. If anybody out there would like to ask a question that I have not asked, I'm not omniscient, I'm not all-knowing, feel free to do so. But I think otherwise what you should do is go to this get your copy 10% off, use code event so you can join the modern world and also become a collector of Gerald Nicosia's books. It is always, Jerry, such an incredible treat to talk to you.
Well, while we're waiting for the questions, hopefully some questions will come in. Let me just say something about Barbara's, because as you pointed out, I was a lot of strip clubs when I was young, but we didn't have any bookstores out there in Lyons, and when I started learning about the beat writers through friends at Morton High School and through that great teacher, Mr. Baisu, I wanted to get if I went to ordinary bookstores,
they didn't have them. Yeah.
The beats were, a lot of people considered them criminal, obscene.
Of course.
And so someone clued me into Barbara's bookstore on Wells Street. Well, actually, I'll tell you this. Ferlinghetti was giving a reading there in 1966, and a couple of friends brought me down there to hear Ferlinghetti read at Barbara's in the 90s. And I discovered this bookstore. Wow, they've got Beats, they've got Kerouac, they've got Henry Miller. All
they had it all, man.
And so then going down to Barbara's became a ritual trip for me. I think I told you it was like sacred ground to me. When I'd walk in that beautiful, high, narrow, old, funky old Street, when I would walk in that door and see those bookshelves, it was like, oh my God, I'm in,
I'm in heaven.
This is heaven.
I'm in heaven.
Which should I go to first, And so I would continually go down there to find the books that nobody else would carry. So, Barbara's was holy ground for me when I was young.
It still is holy ground. People are writing in saying, can't wait for your next book. That's not really a question, because what you should do, young lady, is go out and buy all of his previous books so you don't have to wait. You can read until his next book comes out. Jerry, you take care of yourself out there. I know there are fires. I know there's a crazy, crazy life.
The whole country's in trouble right now, you know?
Yeah. I just hope we all get out of it. It is as of the fact that you and I were able to do this high-tech miracle, this what you called a virtual book event. It gives me hope. It gives me hope for the future, and it just gives me hope, Jerry. That's all.
It's fun. It's a lot of fun.
Hope, this was fun. This was fun. Without hope, what is there?
Somebody said they want to hear another poem. Can I read? Do I have time to read another poem?
Sure.
All right. I'd like to read one for Jan Kerouac, because we've talked about Jan a lot.
Sure.
Jack Kerouac's daughter, who died.
This is the perfect way to end this encounter.
In memoriam, Jan Kerouac. Jan, we walked together down Lower East Side streets, almost got run over by a few cabs. You got angry at me, dawdling and dreaming in the middle of New York streets. You can't do that in New York, she said. And I can if I'm a philosopher, I said. Yeah, you'll get killed, she said. Maybe I don't care, I said. Oh, man, you're weird, she mocked in raunchiest New York accent. But she liked playing mother to me and everyone around her. Maybe because no mother or father most of the time in her own life. Teaching people how to cook apple pie the proper way. Actually more of an English pie than American, she lectured Stanley and Lil out in Northport, our nostrils filled with cinnamon and melted sugar as we all eagerly awaited the fruits of the baking. Jan was a lover of people, a loner and unloved herself, who always had a gift for everyone, didn't care that her own purse was mostly empty, her bedroom full of luscious clothes, but no one to model them for. At the end, she kept leaving herself notes, and when her eyes got bad, she wrote on a chalkboard, "Remember to buy TV dinners," she'd write, and still forget to buy them. But the nurses at the hospital fed her for free, and she died full of the admiration and respect of more than a few of us who still care about her.
Gerald Nicosia, you are an incredible hero of mine. You're a great writer, and I will talk to you in any fashion that is available for us to talk for the rest of my life. We may even get even more high tech than this, though. This I think is as high tech as I can get. Jerry and you folks at Barbara's, you can find a replay of this too. It'll be on YouTube. You can listen to it again. You can click on this little thing here to get 10% off your copy of Beat Scrapbook, but I would recommend getting all of Jerry's books. It would make a fabulous bookstore, a bookshelf in whatever house you live. Jerry, best to you. Take care. Be well. Be safe. And eventually this stuff will all be over, right?
Yeah, and if I ever get my vaccination, I may come back to Chicago and we'll do a real live book event somewhere in Chicago. Would you do that with me?
Wait a minute, I'm not sure I even know how to do that anymore. Jerry, take care.
We'll go out for an Italian beef sandwich afterward.
Take care, and thank you, Barbara. Thank you for doing this thing, and take care, everybody. All these people are being really nice to you.
Take care. Thank you all for